1975, San Francisco Bay Area. A grieving writer, distraught over the recent death of her daughter, re-examines an unpublished 1968 short story she had written at a local writer's workshop with fresh eyes. Inspired, she sits at her typewriter and begins. 6 weeks later, the first draft of Anne Rice's first novel, Interview with the Vampire, would be completed. When it was published in 1976, it would change the realm of vampire fiction forever, carving out new folklore from old legends, redefining a genre, and laying the groundwork for the modern vampire narrative. But Interview with the Vampire is more than a modern vampire novel. In 2018, 42 years removed from its publication, it would be remiss to discount the cultural zeitgeist and personal hell that created the novel. Long before its sequels made it a publishing industry smash hit, Interview with the Vampire was a slow-burn, word-of-mouth sensation, particularly inside certain marginalized communities. For many fans of vampire stories, Interview with the Vampire and the rest of the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice were our definitive introduction to the seductive realm of the predator. I discovered the novel first at 6 years old, already a precocious reader, and then again at age 18, when it is no understatement to say that it changed my life. I'm Rose Sinister. I've spent the last 5 years as a professional vampire tour guide in New Orleans French Quarter, and I've been obsessed with stories about the undead for over 30 years. Suffice to say, I'm that nerd, and these are my favorite vampire stories. At its heart, Interview with a Vampire is a novel about the bonds of blood, of family, and attachment. The novel begins with the nearly 200-year-old vampire, Louis de Pontelac, narrating the events of his vampiric transformation and the years following to an unnamed journalist in San Francisco in the mid-1970s, contemporary to the novel's publication. The story, however, is largely set in and around New Orleans, beginning in 1791. Included in Louis' tale are Lestat, the vampire who turned him, and Claudia, the doomed, eternally childlike vampire created by Louis and Lestat both. And throughout the novel, all three are forced to grapple with their own perceptions of the bonds that bind them to each other, drive them apart, and detach them from humanity. As the novel progresses from the 18th century and into the 19th, Louis' relationship with Claudia intensifies, while his relationship with Lestat deteriorates, culminating in Claudia's violent attempt to murder Lestat before she and Louis sail away to Europe. Only on the eve of their departure do they realize, too late, that the attempted murder was unsuccessful, as Lestat returns from the swamps in which he's been dumped with a soggy vengeance. Despite a hurried attempt to set Lestat on fire before fleeing New Orleans and the United States, the consequences of their failure to completely destroy the other vampire would ultimately play out to catastrophic effect. In Paris, the erstwhile pair find themselves in the company of other vampires like themselves, and for a brief period there is the promise of new bonds forming for both Louis and Claudia, new families for both of them. But Lestat's arrival in Paris heralds the pair's doom. For his part in Lestat's near destruction, Louis is condemned to be buried alive. For her greater role in the crime, Claudia is locked inside a courtyard and exposed to the daylight, killing her. It's one of the saddest moments in the book, and one of total defeat for Louis, who despite his revenge on the Parisian vampires is never able to completely get over the loss of his companion of so many decades. By the end of the novel, he's determined that isolation must be the defining experience of immortality. So the novel asks the reader essential questions pertaining to loss and love and life and death. What is evil? And can an inherently evil creature such as a vampire still endeavor to live a moral life? As I've pointed out, Anne Rice was writing her novel in 1975 while deeply entrenched in the process of grief following the tragic death of her own young daughter from a rare form of childhood leukemia, and she was writing at a specific moment and place in American history that would inevitably and uniquely shape her narrative. Tennessee Williams once famously quoted, "America has 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Everywhere else is Cleveland." It's no wonder, then, that a quintessentially modern, quintessentially American vampire novel would touch down in at least 2 of these 3 American cities of Williams' quip. San Francisco in the 1970s was an incredible place, to say the least, unlike anywhere else in the United States at the time. It was a battleground for progressive politics, sexual liberation, high crime, and danger. In the 70s, San Francisco emerged as the pornography capital of the world. The 1970 film Pornography in Denmark was a watershed moment for loosening previously established obscenity laws, and the 1973 Supreme Court case Miller v. California redefined these laws further. Across the city, shops and storefronts catered to prurient desires, and the sexual liberation movement at the time was anything goes. It's easy to see how the vampire would become so sensualized by mere virtue of proximity to this environment. And then there were the Zodiac killings, which had terrorized the city between 1968 and 1971. The Zodiac killer taunted police and the public alike, striking down victims seemingly indiscriminately without ever being caught. This, and other unsolved murders of the day, would certainly have supported the fictional plausibility of vampires among us, indiscriminate killers, unknown to the waking world and untouched by mortal justice. And there were the first major gay rights victories in San Francisco starting in the early 1970s, and the city became a safe haven for members of the LGBT community who flocked to San Francisco, frequently leaving behind homes where they had been unwelcome or even attacked. But in the city by the bay, they were free to forge new bonds, new identities, new families. I can't help but see a connection between these communities of outcast and the detached communities of the damned in Rice's novel, whether the small, unholy Trinity family unit comprised of Louis, Claudia, and Lestat, or the larger coven of Parisian vampires. But San Francisco was the home of Rice's choosing, and not of birth. She had been born and raised in New Orleans, leaving the Crescent City behind as a teenager. She returned there in spirit for her debut novel, extrapolating from personal recollection certain environmental details, filling in the rest with research, creating a picture of a place and time long forgotten by living memory. Returning to the city of her youth must have been an act of defiance and nostalgia, her own work mirrored in the pilgrimage her character Louis makes towards the end of the novel, coming home to New Orleans one last time. Anne's upbringing in the Irish Channel neighborhood was marked by financial hardship, compelling Catholic faith, her bohemian mother's substance abuse and untimely demise, community, and a sense of history. At the time in her life she was frantically pounding out Interview with the Vampire on the typewriter. Returning to New Orleans was in many ways a return to an innocence shattered by loss and the dual demons of OCD and alcoholism, which she has admitted in interviews that she suffered from following her daughter's death. What better metaphor than a vampire to cope with these nightmares? Vampires are defined by their compulsion for, their addiction to human blood. They are agents of destruction inasmuch as mental illness or substance abuse issues are. Like San Francisco in the 1970s, New Orleans in the last years of the 18th and early years of the 19th centuries was a city of sin and poorly controlled vice, relatively liberal sexual mores, not to mention violence and death. In New Orleans to such a shocking degree that the locals were mostly blasé to the frequent appearance of corpses at their stoops or bloating in the middle of the street. If San Francisco was the perfect backdrop to begin her novel, New Orleans was the perfect place in which to actually set it. "1791 was a curious point in New Orleans history. The city was rapidly being rebuilt from a fire which had destroyed most of the buildings in 1788, and the city would burn again in 1794. Were it not for the introduction of sugarcane granulation on the plantation of Jean-Antoine Boret in 1795 just outside New Orleans, the city might not have recovered to the extent that it did. But within just a few short years after the start of Interview with the Vampire, the city was newly built, sugarcane was proving to be a cash crop soon to be known as white gold of Saint-Dominique on the island of Hispaniola. Uprisings on the plantations there would give rise to the nation of Haiti in 1804. And this turmoil further cemented Louisiana's place as a major global producer of sugarcane. Within a decade of that revolution, New Orleans was awash with teeming throngs of refugees from the island, American entrepreneurs and fortune seekers from elsewhere in the world, and Louisiana had officially become American following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Life in New Orleans was not easy or guaranteed. One might arrive in the city with pockets full of dreams and be dead within 6 months. Outbreaks were common. Particularly devastating were outbreaks caused by poor sanitation, such as cholera, and mosquitoes, such as yellow fever. Often these outbreaks of contagion were simply called the plague. Death was common. Cemeteries often overflowed, bodies piled up. Easy picking for the vampire, where one might not even notice an otherwise healthy body dumped together with the rotting masses of plague victims, for instance. In folklore, before the advent of germ theory, vampirism is often used as a device for understanding the mechanisms of disease transference. A common indicator of a vampire infestation in communities was repeated sightings of a deceased person by other members of the community, particularly the person's loved ones. We know now that the mind plays horrible tricks on the grieving brain, and that sightings of a lost loved one, either in dreams or in the nameless faces in a crowd, for instance, are normal, ordinary ways for processing loss. Against this backdrop in New Orleans, the character Claudia becomes the metaphor for the fruits of grief grown from the soil of contagion, the creation of life out of death, the eternal child unable to die, unable to grow into the maturity of womanhood, just as Anne's daughter, in death, was deprived of her future growth into womanhood and beyond. I don't want to project too much here, but it's worth noting that only in the last and final draft of the story, the one which was ultimately published, did Claudia meet her tragic demise. In later years, Anne has come around more publicly and mulled on the process of letting go of her daughter, which she claims to have been unaware of at the time she was writing. Grief alters us in many ways, leads us down dark roads of questioning the very foundations of our worldviews. In the storm of grief, essential morality becomes sometimes questionable. What is good? What is evil if pain and loss and death are all that define our experience of grief? Louis, in his grief after losing and failing to protect his brother Paul, ultimately falls under the vampire's spell. Anne, driven to the point of obsession with germs, sickness, and disease in the aftermath of Michelle's passing, ultimately fell under the thrall of her immortal vampire characters. But these were not the only vampires on Anne Rice's mind when she was writing her novel. The television show Dark Shadows originally ran from 1966 to 1971, but it wasn't until 1967 that the infamous vampire character Barnabas Collins was introduced, originally meant as a brief storyline to jolt the show out of complacency and the threat of cancellation. Instead, the character became a fan favorite, and the entire run of the show was practically reinvented around him. Barnabas was somewhat unique among 20th century vampires up to that point, who were seldom tormented by feelings of responsibility for the deaths they caused. Barnabas's lament over what he had become is known to have played a role in inspiring Interview with a Vampire, which is especially evident when you examine the timeline of the novel's development. Barnabas Collins was introduced as a character on the TV show in 1967, and the short story that would be expanded into the first draft of Interview with a Vampire was written in 1968, 7 years before Anne would revisit the subject again. But it was another vampire, one from Anne's childhood, that she is stated as having provided the most vivid inspiration for her iconic reluctant vampire, and that was Maria Zaleska, portrayed by Gloria Holden in 1936's Dracula's Daughter. Anne Rice was born in 1941, and she would recall watching the classic horror film as a young girl when it aired on television or was shown as a Saturday morning matinee. In that film, Maria is literally presented as Dracula's daughter, and she is desperate to lift the curse which causes her to crave and desire human blood. Another fascinating element of that film is the not completely veiled homoeroticism, scandalous for its time, which would also show up later in Anne's writing. Although the production code of the era took pains to obscure the lesbian overtones of the character and her desire. Now, homoerotic themes in vampire stories are certainly nothing new, of course. In 1872, Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu penned the explicitly lesbian-themed Carmilla, which in turn inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, who appeared multiple times in film, inspiring Dracula's daughter, inspiring Anne Rice. While I plan to discuss both Carmilla and Dracula each in depth in later episodes, I bring them up here to illustrate a point I often make while giving French Quarter vampire tours. That we are still crafting, cultivating, and curating our own vampire folklore, only we call it fiction now. And in so doing, we often deprive ourselves of the deeper meanings these stories are meant to embody, the warnings and taboos they're meant to communicate. And that's the point of this podcast, really. So, what then of folklore? In examining Anne Rice's vampires, how do they compare with their folklore brethren? Ultimately, in Interview with a Vampire, there's not one, but two separate and distinct types of vampire to be discovered. One is the cogent, humanoid in appearance, emotionally fluent vampires such as the protagonist and other main characters, and the other is merely a revenant, a bleakly reanimated corpse, stumbled upon in one of the more frightening segments of the book, where Louis and Claudia embark on a journey through Eastern Europe and find not vampires like themselves, but true, shambling monsters which spark an existential horror in Louis. The latter type of vampire would be the one more familiar to populations which feared vampires for hundreds of years, often going to extreme lengths to rid their communities of these threats. The former is mostly a product of evolving 19th and 20th century fiction. It is also of interesting note that the Revenant-style vampire Claudia and Louis encounter in Eastern Europe portion of their journey does not appear anywhere else in Rice's Vampire Chronicles. Whereas vampires in folklore are often used as scapegoats to explain mysterious outbreaks and epidemics, Stoker elaborated on this concept in Dracula, presenting vampiric transformation as a transmissible form of demonic possession, almost like a virus, with all the metaphors for death and sex and violence implicit in the necessary blood exchange. By the time we get to Anne Rice's vampires, especially the vampires in Interview with the vampire is no longer specifically a metaphor for disease transference, but the sexual elements of the transformation process remain. Vampires in Eastern Europe are as varied as the cultures and communities that created them, but it is the Romanian vampire tradition that has fueled the imagination of most English-language vampire novelists, following the traditions of Polidori, Le Fanu, Stoker, etc. Most early vampire legends described truly horrifying creatures. Their hair and nails appeared longer and unkempt. Their skin was often described as ruddy and livid. They were bloated, shambling, inelegant creatures. Point for point in her novel, Anne Rice inverts the folklore to describe a preternatural being with lustrous, flowing hair, smooth, glassy nails, stark white skin, and superhuman, alluring grace. This is why the vampire creature Louis and Claudia discover and destroy in Eastern Europe is so horrifying both to them and the reader. And here as well, Anne continues in one of the nastier elements of late 19th and 20th century vampire literature, creating a strong distinction between the civilized Western Europe and the backwater threat to that civilization presented in Eastern Europe. I think sometimes certain tropes become so ingrained as archetypes, we fail to immediately recognize the bigoted dog whistle embedded in them. I also think Anne was doing more than parroting racist Victorian tropes here too. I think she was emphasizing the completely alien nature of her vampires, totally set apart from even the most extreme fringes of ordinary human experience. Anne Rice's vampires set the standard for the fictional vampire among vampire fans. For so long, elements from her creation became archetypical as well. So much so that when the vampires in the Twilight Saga deviated from her tropes, it inspired a backlash against the whole Cullen clan. It wasn't the high school girl has a vampire boyfriend plot that bothered so much because, let's face it, Buffy did the same thing in the 90s. But the Twilight vampires lacking both fangs and the possibility of solar incineration? Unforgivable. But neither of these popular cliches is particularly supported by folklore. Very early in the novel, Lestat makes it clear to Louis that the sun will destroy his newly transformed body, burning up the blood inside it, and later, this prediction comes horrifyingly true, not in the destruction of Louis, but Claudia. As poignant and, perhaps to the author, cathartic as this element of the story may be, the notion of vampires being harmed by the sun is very thinly supported by established myths. While most vampires in folklore are commonly described as nocturnal, stronger at night, or perhaps even compelled to return to their coffin at sunrise, others are decidedly more active between noon and midnight, resting between midnight and noon. There's no consensus then or now as to whether or not vampires should be negatively impacted by the sun, but Murnau's 1922 silent film Nosferatu made a compelling visual in favor of the argument for solar destruction, and the notion has mostly stuck since. I'm going to be talking about Nosferatu in my next episode, so I'll have more to say about that then. The fangs that Anne Rice's vampires, and so many others, are so notorious for sporting has a more interesting evolution through folklore and literature. It's likely that the description of vampires in folklore as having elongated teeth is simply a consequence of the natural dehydration of the corpse as it decays, causing the gums to retreat. Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, in 1820 did not have fangs, but Varney the vampire in the Victorian Penny Dreadful serials sometimes appeared to, especially if his bloodlust was particularly severe. Jonathan Harker in Dracula describes the account when they first meet as being long in the tooth, but it's important to understand that, to the Victorian reader, this would have been clearly noted as describing the Count as appearing aged, as well as stressing his animalistic je ne sais quoi. But Dracula does sport fangs in his first theatrical appearance, a necessity of stagecraft required to visibly set the titular monster apart from the human characters. And this famously carried over to the 1931 Browning-directed, Bela Lugosi-starring production of Dracula, and the fangs have stuck around ever since as the ultimate visible hallmark of the vampire's otherness. and understanding the vampire's otherness is key to understanding the vampire's relevance to pop culture today. It's been 42 years since Interview with the Vampire was published. 4 decades, 13 sequels, and millions of fans around the world later, the novel remains an iconic classic in the realm of vampire literature, one of only a few in that genre afforded status as literary rather than genre fiction, and when you read the novel, it's easy to understand why. Anne Rice's hypnotic prose and lush descriptions of places and events have rightly been praised by fans and critics alike, but lovely writing does not a classic novel make. In the cutthroat world of publishing, few books remain on the market even a year or two after being printed. Only the smallest percentage reach a quarter century in print, and fewer still can claim the 4 decades Interview with the Vampire has. It's obvious that this is, to many, more than just a novel. So what is it? Why has a relatively slim novel about a reluctant 18th century planter turned vampire and his quest for meaning across 3 centuries resonated with so many? For many vampire fans today, especially those of us over 35, Interview with the Vampire was the first vampire novel we discovered. I know that was the case for me. It really did inspire an endless host of imitators in a way that few of other vampire stories have. And for the first time, the reader was given insight into the mind, worldview, and experience of the vampire, the other, the outsider. I suspect that many of us who already felt like the alienated, the outsider, and the other in our own lives felt strangely validated by Louis's experiences. We didn't have to be predators with a ruthless quest for human blood to commiserate with his fall from grace, his shattered faith, his endless moral philosophizing. We didn't have to be faced with his specific moral quagmires to draw parallels in our own lives. And there's a specific group of readers who saw themselves, neither necessarily in Louis or Lestat, perhaps, but in their relationship, in the homoerotic overtones of Louis's transformation. For many readers, this mirrored their own experience in coming to understand their identity within the LGBT community. If Louis's quest for damnation and isolation from his mortal family is read as a metaphor for the self-loathing that so many young, queer, questioning people have often felt, then Louis's transformation at the hands of Lestat might be interpreted by some as metaphorical for the pivotal same-sex encounter that firmly cements that burgeoning identity. The manner in which Louis is forever outcast from humanity following said transformation parallels the tragic reality that many people still experience upon coming out. We like to think that we're better about this now, but better isn't enough for the tens of thousands of LGBTQ+ youth who still find themselves cast out, homeless, and susceptible to predation. The vampire inverts this vulnerability, transforming the outsider from victim into indestructible, homeless, and susceptible to predation. The vampire inverts this vulnerability, transforming the outsider from victim into indestructible creature of power and wealth and beauty. It's fantasy escapism, but it's identity-affirming fantasy escapism. And so at last, the unholy trinity family unit of Louis, Lestat, and Claudia, or even the Paris Coven of Vampires, serves as a metaphor for the assembled family unit that has long been the backbone of the queer community, then and now. The blood of the covenant is stronger than the waters of the womb, after all. Rose Sinister's Vampires is a bi-weekly podcast about vampires and pop culture. Next time, I'm going to be talking about the earliest surviving cinematic vampire, Count Orlok from 1922's Nosferatu, and why we need to pay particularly close attention to the anti-Semitic symbolism the movie never tried to hide. I hope you'll join me for that episode, and for the rest that follow. After you've subscribed to this podcast, check out my website, rosesinister.com, where you'll find contact forms and links to my social media presence if you'd like to stay in touch. Thanks for listening.